Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Excellencies, we'll begin in the usual way by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and by paying our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, past and present. My name is Brendan Taylor and I'm the head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre here at the ANU, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's John Gee Memorial Lecture. A very special welcome to John Gee's family and friends, especially to Nick and Chrissy. It's lovely to keep up this tradition and to see you. Sorry, Rebecca. to see you again. It's hard to believe this is actually the 15th lecture in the series. The series, of course, was an initiative led by Bob Matthews, and Bob, it's lovely to see you here again this evening, and Rod Barton, who sends his apologies. And the series was in collaboration with the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, including a couple of other colleagues. Hugh White was critically involved in the early days. Hugh, thanks so much for coming along. It's great to see you here. And Gareth Evans, of course, who's been a stalwart supporter of the series. It's a series that's designed to reflect the views in areas related to John Gee's very distinguished career and his achievement, including contemporary and future challenges. And certainly this evening's lecture fits absolutely perfectly with that theme. Previous lectures in the series have included the Honourable Gareth Evans, of course, our former Australian Foreign Minister and Chancellor at the ANU, former Prime Minister, the Honourable Malcolm Fraser, Mr. Peter Varghese when he was Secretary of DFAT, and most recently the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mr. Rafael Mariano Grossi. It's my particular pleasure and privilege to introduce this year's lecturer, my colleague and my friend, and up until only a few months ago, my boss, Professor Tony Erskine. Tony has recently finished an absolutely stellar 5-year term as Director of the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs here at the ANU, adding to an already very distinguished academic career that has included posts at the University of Aberystwyth in Wales, the University of Cambridge, and the University of New South Wales. She is currently Professor of International Politics here in the Coral Bell School, and also an Associate Fellow of the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge University. Tony also serves as academic lead for the United Nations AI for the Social Good Research Project, and in this capacity she works closely with the government departments in Thailand and Bangladesh. As if that's not enough, she's also editor of the highly regarded journal International Theory, and is the recipient of the International Studies Association's 2024 International Ethics Distinguished Scholar Award. Tony, I don't know how you managed to do it all, but I'm absolutely delighted that you're able to deliver this year's lecture. As you know, the invitation to Tony actually came originally a couple of years ago, but various things intervened, including a few lockdowns and a pandemic. But Tony has very graciously accommodated those and agreed to, has always been very keen to deliver the lecture. And I know I speak on behalf of John Gee's family and friends and Bob, and saying how delighted we are that you're able to be here in person to deliver this year's lecture. Tony, I think that the turnout tonight for your lecture reflects not only your very significant academic achievements, but also the timeliness of the subject matter on which you're speaking this evening, before Algorithmic Armageddon, the immediate risks of AI and war. So without further ado, many thanks again, Tony, for agreeing to deliver the lecture, and very much looking forward to what you have to say. Please join me in welcoming Professor Erskine to the podium.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for being here, despite the apocalyptic rain, which maybe is appropriate since I'm giving a talk called Before Algorithmic Armageddon. I'd like to begin also by paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, elders, and their ancestors, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. Thank you, Brendan, for your very generous introduction. And I'd also like to express my sincere thanks to the Gee family for the honor and privilege of delivering the lecture this evening. And it's wonderful to have members of the family in the audience tonight. Dr. John Gee was a distinguished Australian diplomat with a remarkable career. Among many other roles, he served as Deputy Director General for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague until 2003. And he's remembered for his important contributions to disarmament and arms control, with a particular focus on chemical weapons. Taking inspiration from Dr. Gee's profoundly important work, the lectures in this series have focused on so-called weapons of mass destruction, those weapons with the capacity to inflict catastrophic destruction and loss of life, and which are, by their very nature, indiscriminate. The previous 3 John Gee Memorial Lectures, for example, have focused on the role and the regulation of nuclear weapons. And I know we've got one of those lectures in the audience tonight, Hugh White. With the 2015 lecture before that, addressing Australia's laudable record of contributing to the global fight against the spread of nuclear weapons and the use of chemical and biological weapons. In the lecture this evening, I'm going to make a few departures from these previous presentations. To begin, I'm going to address a category of weapon that has not yet been addressed in this series. And namely, I'm going to address weapons and other military tools that rely on artificial intelligence, or AI. Admittedly, the AI-enabled military tools that I'm going to talk about this evening are significantly different from the chemical and nuclear weapons that have been the subject of the previous lectures. They raise distinct problems for the exercise of restraint in war. We should have different reasons for wanting to regulate and restrict them. Moreover, the particular risks that accompany these weapons should generate unique responsibilities amongst those who design and develop and also deploy them. But despite their distinctiveness, the steady adoption of AI technologies for military purposes by Australia and our allies and adversaries evoke a core concern that Dr. Gee was committed to addressing. How can we promote restraint in war and adherence to international norms in the face of new technologies and the novel ways of killing and exercising coercive force that accompany them? We hear a great deal about how AI is influencing every aspect of our lives. It's hard to avoid discussions about ChatGPT, for example, and other so-called generative AI. It's certainly something we've been talking a lot about at the university. War, in particular, is a realm where the emergence of AI has engendered a huge amount of attention and debate among scholars and policymakers, particularly with respect to the prospect of lethal autonomous weapon systems, or more colloquially, killer robots, intelligent machines that could make and carry out decisions about whom to target and kill without human intervention. Moreover, a fear that has recently gained some prominence is that advanced AI systems of the future, including weapon systems, will have enormous potential for harm, and that this will eventually be beyond the power of individuals, of states, and of humanity generally to control. Such speculation includes warnings that AI systems that are delegated decision-making powers on the use of force might evolve one day to have their own intentions and their own purposes and pose an existential threat to the human entities that they see as obstacles to their own flourishing. These future-focused fears generate far-reaching debates and some serious questions, but they won't be my focus tonight. This attention to killer robots and to the proposed existential threat of a future AI that escapes our determination and control has eclipsed, I think, a more mundane, more insidious, and more immediate risk, which accompanies the current use of AI in organized violence. I want to suggest that a neglected threat that existing AI-enabled military tools pose is that they change how we, as citizens, as soldiers, as states, deliberate, how we act, and how we view ourselves as responsible agents. and that this in turn has potentially profound ethical, political, and even geopolitical implications. In making this proposal, I'm going to do three things. First, I'll comment on the moral status of intelligent machines and say something about why this matters. Second, I'll draw on some of my recent research to highlight the risk of what I call misplaced responsibility, a risk that accompanies the increased use of AI in war, and identify 4 factors that I think contribute to this. Third, I'm going to ask you to join me in considering how we can mitigate this risk. However, before I take these 3 steps, it might be useful to say something about the types of entities that I'm referring to when I talk about AI infiltrating the practice of war. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is the evolving capability of machines to imitate aspects of intelligent human behavior. AI tends to be used as a general label then for the various technologies that display this capability. When discussing AI-driven systems used in war, which for the purposes of this lecture, I'll simply call AI-enabled military tools, I'm referring to entities from algorithmic systems to automated robots. These include decision support systems, which rely on big data, analytics, and machine learning to make predictions and recommendations that aid human decision-making. For example, machine learning algorithms, which analyze huge quantities of data quickly, uncovering patterns of correlation in data sets that are beyond human cognition, are used to recommend targets for drone strikes and have been used, for example, by the United States for drone strikes in Yemen. These algorithms effectively predict targets by uncovering correlations in large amounts of data drawn from individuals' text messages, web browsing, email, and location. Machine learning algorithms are also likely, I think, to be increasingly used to assist governments with consequential decisions on whether to wage war by, for example, estimating threats, anticipating potential adversaries' movements, predicting the risk of inaction, and forecasting mission costs. Such algorithms are already used in intelligence analyses, which indirectly inform state-level decisions on the resort to force. AI-enabled military tools also include automated weapons, which perform tasks with varying degrees of independence from human intervention. One example is the Super Aegis II, a South Korean robotic sentry, essentially an automated turret that has been tested in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. It has the capacity to identify, track, and shoot targets without the need for human mediation. However, it's being configured to require a human operator to provide authorization to shoot. So the human operator provides this authorization by entering a password in a nearby computer after the robotic sentry has identified a target and before the shot is fired. And this requirement for human authorization is what we call having a human in the loop. The Super Aegis II was first introduced in 2010, and it's still in use, but more sophisticated automated weapons have since been developed and are currently being used, including Turkey's Cargo 2 drone, which is a small loitering munition. It's about 7 kilograms, it's quite small, with a facial recognition system and machine learning algorithms embedded on the platform. You might recognize the Cargo 2 drone as having gained some infamy as possibly the first automated weapon to have attacked and killed a human target in Libya in 2020 in fully autonomous mode, so without a human in the loop, according to a 2021 report by the UN Security Council. However, like the Super Aegis II, the Cargo 2 drone is generally configured to require a human in the loop, so that a human operator authorizes targets and engages the attack mode. Now, the neglected risk that I'm highlighting this evening applies both to decision support systems used in war and to automated weapons designed and deployed with the ostensible safety nets of humans in the loop. In other words, I'm not interested this evening in risks associated with the increased autonomy of AI systems so that they can act without human control. Rather, I'm interested in a set of risks that emerge in what may seem to be more innocuous scenarios, when AI-driven decision support systems and weapons make recommendations and initiate actions on the basis of which human beings must ultimately make the relevant life and death decisions. Now, I want to begin my account of a particular risk that accompanies the use of these intelligent machines by commenting on their moral status. I'll leave the Cargo 2 drone up there for a moment because it's the sort of entity that I'm going to be interrogating and what I have to say next. Now, I have to admit that this is something that I do with some trepidation in the context of this particular lecture. It requires me momentarily to put my philosopher's hat on and move into territory that is not usually addressed in this series, but please bear with me. Addressing the moral status of AI-enabled weapons and decision support systems is profoundly important. It requires us to interrogate their capacities, allows us to analyze what we can and cannot reasonably expect of these machines, and is absolutely central to understanding how they tend to be radically misperceived. So powerful international norms have been established when it comes to the use of force in international politics. Prohibitions against waging wars of aggression, for example, and against conduct in which civilians are intentionally targeted or in which force is used disproportionately. And these latter two norms, of course, underlie our opposition to the use of chemical and also nuclear weapons. These norms are codified in international law, passionately appealed to in international condemnations, as we've seen, when they're violated, and their recognition is an important part of the relationship between states. They ground frequently invoked responsibilities to exercise restraint in war. Such responsibilities to exercise restraint are directed at states, like Australia, soldiers on the battlefield, military and political leaders in the war room, and citizens like you and me when it comes to voting for and censuring the states and leaders that act in our name, and indeed contemplating new responsibilities in the face of emerging and disruptive technologies like I'm proposing to do in this lecture this evening. Importantly, these responsibilities to exercise restraint can only coherently be directed towards entities that qualify as moral agents or duty bearers, those that possess the capacities for understanding and reflecting on such requirements and for acting in such a way as to conform to them. So everyone in this room, I assume, is a moral agent, has those capacities to qualify as one. My very straightforward, and I think uncontroversial point, is that whether we're talking about seemingly ubiquitous language generative models like ChatGPT, the Super Aegis 2 synthetic soldier that I just talked about, or the Cargo 2 drone, AI-enabled systems are not moral agents. I don't think that's a controversial point to make. They're not bodies that we can reasonably expect to do the right thing or bear the burden of blame in the wake of harm or wrongdoing. Simply, current incarnations of intelligent machines lack the specific cognitive capacities that would allow them to qualify as such. They're not able to understand their actions or reflect on the outcomes of their actions, nor are they able to evaluate the complex codes and algorithms with which they've been programmed. They lack what I call reflexive autonomy. They're not moral agents or bearers of duties. Rather, they are our tools. Moral responsibilities to exercise restraint in war, blame when they're derogated from, remain with the individual and the institutional agents that variously deploy, operate, rely on, and oversee these tools. Yet, and here's the catch, we have a tendency to mistakenly assume that our AI-enabled tools possess capacities that they simply do not. The danger is that we may then see our responsibilities as somehow diminished or forfeited altogether to an intelligent machine in the context of some decisions and actions. I refer to this risk, which accompanies our reliance on AI-enabled military tools, as misplaced responsibility in war. Now, at least 4 factors contribute to my concern about the risk of misplaced responsibility when we rely on these AI-enabled military tools in war. First, we have a tendency to wildly misattribute characteristics to intelligent machines. This has struck me recently when people respond to language generative models like ChatGPT that use predictive machine learning techniques to create text that sounds plausible and even sounds human. There are assumptions made that these algorithms are understanding and reflecting on what they're communicating, and even, according to some people, achieving some degree of consciousness, when in fact, they're simply using statistical inference to string together words. Moreover, even though intelligent machines do not feel pain or suffer, again, I think that's uncontroversial, those human beings that act alongside them are often inclined to believe that they do. Fascinating cases of human actors feeling empathy towards injured robots and demanding that they be treated with moral consideration deserve attention. And I'd like to, if I may, share with you one such documented case involving a military robot, the length of a small adult, described as modeled on a stick insect with a multitude of legs, which was designed to tread on and destroy landmines, thereby protecting soldiers from risk. I have a more recent iteration in the image here. This is a number of years later than the one that I'm going to describe, but this was one that was deployed in Ukraine recently. So the test run for this military robot was witnessed by both a military audience and also the engineer who designed it. The test run was also documented by a journalist who was there, and I'm going to draw on his account and what I'll tell you. So for the engineer who created this military robot, its test run was a huge success. And quoting the journalist, every time it found a mine, blew it up, and lost a limb, it picked itself up and readjusted to move forward on its remaining legs, continuing to clear a path through the minefield. And it did this repeatedly. It moved forward, encountered a mine, which was then exploded. It lost another limb, and then it proceeded forward. Eventually, it had only one remaining leg. Still, according to the report, and I quote, it pulled itself forward. At this point, however, the colonel who was overseeing the exercise could take no more and ordered that it be halted. The test, he charged, was inhumane. And I find this striking and also worrying. If it's so easy to misperceive military robots as sentient beings, after all, the stick insect minesweeper was not a particularly sophisticated example of artificial intelligence. Might we not be similarly moved to attribute capacities required for moral agency to military robots and algorithmic systems when they don't actually qualify? And it seems that this is indeed what we do. A second factor that contributes to the risk of misplaced responsibility in war when we rely on AI-enabled military tools is that the very nature of automated systems exacerbates our tendency to attribute to them capacities that they don't possess. We are affected by what's called automation bias, or the tendency to ignore or fail to seek contradictory information when faced with a computer-generated solution that we unquestioningly accept as being correct. Automation bias has been studied in the context of decision support systems in hospitals for diagnostics and in the cockpits of commercial airplanes. It could have particularly consequential effects in war if the human operator of the types of military tools that we are discussing sees herself as the obedient recipient of instructions rather than the ultimate decision maker. Think of the human operators responding to recommended targets for drone strikes that are produced by algorithms, for example. And indeed, research done on automation bias has demonstrated that it actually increases in high-pressure, time-sensitive contexts. Moreover, discussing the implications of introducing automation to decision support systems embedded in computer interfaces, Mary Cummings, a researcher who was particularly concerned with the design of military weapons, argues that we tend to see an automated system, and I quote, as an independent agent capable of willful action. She warns of the resulting creation of what she calls a moral buffer, which allows people to ethically distance themselves from their own action. A third factor that contributes to the likelihood of one minimizing one's responsibility for life and death decisions when employing AI-enabled tools in war is algorithmic opacity. Machine learning processes are frequently opaque and unpredictable. Those who are guided by algorithmic systems that rely on machine learning often do not understand how predictions and recommendations are reached and do not grasp their limitations, which is particularly important. The recommendations and actions of AI-enabled military tools can often neither be audited nor even accurately interpreted by those who deploy, by those who operate, and are guided by them. These human agents may feel removed from crucial decisions and actions based on these outputs, and also less answerable for their consequences. What this means in the high-stakes environment of war can be especially worrying. The fourth and final factor that I argue contributes to the risk of misplaced responsibility in war when we rely on AI-enabled military tools is that we, imperfect human actors that we are, have a tendency to try to disown responsibility, especially in challenging circumstances, saying both to ourselves and to others that another agent is answerable in our stead for things that we should do or wrongs that we have brought about eases what is aptly described as the weight of responsibility. With this weight ostensibly borne elsewhere, one can take a deep breath, disengage, look away, and maintain a clear conscience. Attempts to redirect or diminish one's responsibility in war have historically been found in illegitimate appeals to superior orders, for example. A newer, I think less understood, and particularly problematic way of achieving this desired unburdening is to redirect responsibility and deflect blame to AI-enabled military tools that may seem to be making decisions on their own. So through the combination of these four factors, there's a risk that the AI-enabled military tools that we have now will undermine human agency. Simply, human actors may feel that they're off the moral hook when their decision-making is seen to be displaced by sophisticated military machines that appear to deliberate and act independently. Our tools become our moral proxies, our moral guides and compasses, and our scapegoats. Moral responsibility is thereby misplaced, and we are diminished. So in sum, regardless of their actual capacities, the perception that AI-enabled military tools are making decisions might prompt the human agents that act alongside them to adjust their self-perception of their own roles and responsibilities. The problem is not the unavoidable human-machine teaming that the prevalence of AI brings to the practice of war, but rather the avoidable abdication of responsibility that threatens to accompany it. Moreover, the detrimental effect of our deference to AI-enabled military tools may not be limited to a degradation of how we see our roles and responsibilities. This damage may also include the related erosion of hard-won, internationally endorsed principles of restraint and the use of force. If the individual and institutional agents to which particular expectations are legitimately directed see themselves displaced as the relevant decision makers. To put it in another way, we may still passionately pay lip service to these norms of restraint, but if there is a disconnect between the bodies that should be discharging these responsibilities of restraint, us, and the entities that we mistakenly believe are making decisions, then these norms will be eroded because nobody will see themselves as answerable for upholding them in particular contexts. So, how do we ensure that human actors are not tempted to shrug off the burden of responsibility due to the presence of intelligent machines, particularly decision support systems and automated weapons that seem to masquerade as moral agents? To begin, I think a crucial principle must be that because AI-driven military tools augment our human capacities, including and especially the capacity for harm, our responsibilities, including our responsibility to exercise restraint, must be understood as magnified rather than redirected or diminished. Indeed, the unique risks that accompany AI-enabled military tools gesture towards a need for what I call supplementary responsibilities of restraint, which should come into effect before they're used on the battlefield or in the war room. I'm thinking of responsibilities in terms of designing AI-enabled weapons and decision support systems and educating those who operate and oversee them, and deploy them, I should add. It will be important to make the decision-making functions of machine intelligence, along with its limitations, more transparent, to refrain from anthropomorphizing artificial intelligence, and to actively discourage the myth of machine moral agency. We should also incorporate explicit cues, I think, into automated weapons and decision support systems that highlight human agency and responsibility. And on this final point, an example of such an explicit cue, even if it wasn't intended as such, can be found by returning to the Super Aegis 2 in the slide that I've got up now. As I've already mentioned, when the machine, the Super Aegis 2, identifies a potential target, the human operator must enter a password into the computer system to unlock the turret's firing ability. Then the operator must give the manual input for the turret to shoot. But something else interesting also happens, which I came across when I was doing some research into these weapons. It seems that in response to the precautionary norm of restraint, that we should actively try to seek to avoid unnecessary casualties, the Super Aegis 2 is always accompanied by a large tripod-mounted speaker, which is known as an acoustic hailing robot. Unfortunately, it's not in this image here, and I think I've got another image, and this is the Super Aegis 2 as well. I am told that this acoustic hailing robot is always accompanying the Super Aegis 2, even though it's out of the frame here. Now, after identifying a potential target, and before receiving the go-ahead from the human operator to fire, the machine broadcasts, "Stop," or "We'll shoot," in Korean, in this context. The plural subject, the "we'll shoot," explicitly, I think, co-opts the human-in-the-loop operator into the decision-making and the lethal action. In other words, the declaration serves not only to warn any trespassers, which I understand to be its purpose, but I'm suggesting also to remind the human operator of her direct role in making the decision to fire the weapon, thereby minimizing any imagined moral buffer. Even better, but perhaps too long-winded, would be, "Stop, or my human operator will decide to shoot." Now, such cues could signal and reinforce the appropriate locus of decision-making responsibility, and perhaps somehow be scaled up when we're talking about future decision support systems that would assist governments to deliberate on the resort to force. And I welcome further suggestions from you about how to reinforce human agency and responsibility when using AI-enabled military tools. So to conclude, well before we reach the so-called singularity of science fiction, when some believe that AI will surpass human intelligence and become a force we're unable to harness. Diverse and often seemingly innocuous technologies will prompt multiple incremental and likely incredibly consequential changes to how we make decisions and see ourselves as responsible agents. This will have a profound effect on how Australia and our allies and adversaries fight wars and make decisions to wage them and deserve our immediate attention. Thank you very much, everyone.